I love how you all at these PACE conferences are so prompt in settling down and getting ready to start. It's one of my favorite things about you all. Thank you so much for coming today to the PACE Annual Conference. We're really pleased to have everybody here today to engage in a really robust day of learning together. Our 2024 conference comes at a time when we're grappling with very serious questions in public education. How do we engage students and improve their outcomes, especially for our state's most vulnerable children and youth who've been underserved for so long? How do we productively engage communities and diverse stakeholders to improve education? How do we balance state versus local control in navigating current challenges? How do we take advantage of new technologies and opportunities to transform our education system? And now, how do we launch and sustain transformative actions, even in the face of declining resources? All of these questions, we believe, are most effectively answered at the intersection of research, policy, and practice. It's our strong belief that only when we work together and create real systems for change at this intersection that we're going to see the kinds of outcomes that we need to see. And so at this critical juncture, we're bringing together nearly 300 California policymakers, researchers, and education leaders, and we're going to take stock of our education system at this point in pandemic recovery, present evidence-based approaches for accelerating student learning, transforming our systems, and improving equity at all levels, from early childhood through K-12 through higher education. And so in the panels that we've lined up for you today, in the spirit of our mission, we're bringing together speakers who represent nearly 30 organizations across the state. And you can just take a minute here to look at the vast array and diversity of speakers who will be bringing a ton of expertise and different perspectives to bear on these critical issues facing the state. But perhaps the most valuable thing about the conference and the attendees is all of you, the people that we have in the room. Our event draws a really unique cross-section of people across state agencies, advocacy organizations, county offices of education, higher education, the legislature, the media, membership associations, nonprofits, philanthropy, research, and schools and districts. What I would like to do is just provide a couple of overarching comments for you before we turn it off to our state of the system. So first, this event is paper-free, but we have many, many resources that we would like to share with you and make sure you access. So there's a barcode up here on the screen. There's also a barcode on every table. So there's a table tent up here on everyone's screen. You take a picture, and that'll take you to the event page. We highly recommend keeping this up on your phone or on your computer for the whole event. This is where you can access event slides. You can access all of the resources that we're directing you to. You can also access Google Forms. This will be used in some of the sessions for asking questions of our panelists. So our conference goals, and this is what I want you to be thinking about as you move through all of the different events that you're going to be participating in today. We want to be clear on the challenges that are facing the system. We also want to highlight ways that people and organizations are already doing things differently to address these challenges. We want to share what transformational actions could look like moving forward and explore what would be needed to support these kinds of actions at scale. And finally, to discuss how to maintain quality in the face of declining resources. And there are several threads that will be pulled throughout all of our sessions today. The first, what is the differential impact or benefit for students in different populations, with a particular focus on students that have been underserved in our education system? What kinds of supports are needed to ensure that student needs are being met statewide? What kinds of data are needed to learn about outcomes and implementation? How can we achieve better coherence and alignment? And what is the role of state versus local leadership? So these are questions that we'll be asking throughout all of the breakouts and that I would like you all to be thinking about as you engage in conversation and raise questions in the sessions that you're in. So we'd like for you to share on social media, whatever platforms you're on. We're on 5 of them these days. And we're using the hashtag 2024 PACE. We also, on the agenda, have everyone's Twitter handles for their organization, so we can make it really easy for you all to engage that way. And without further ado, now I am going to introduce our panelists for the state of the system. And we're going to learn a little bit about where we're at right now as a state. So first, Joseph Bishop is the Executive Director of the UCLA Center for the Transformation of Schools, and he's held a number of state and national education leadership positions. Edgar Cabral is Deputy Legislative Analyst, covering K-12 education for the California Legislative Analyst's Office. Carl Cohn, who has arrived, that's wonderful, is Professor Emeritus at Claremont Graduate University School of Education, and he's served in many prominent roles in education, most notably as the Superintendent of Long Beach Unified and San Diego Unified, as well as being the founding director of the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence. And Lucrecia Santibañez is the co-faculty director of the UCLA Center for the Transformation of Schools and a professor of education in the UCLA School of Education and Information Studies. So please join me in thanking this panel for joining us today. So we're going to start with you, Lucrecia. You've done a lot of research on student attendance and outcomes throughout the pandemic. Can you talk a little bit about the current outlook and why these two indicators are such a big deal?
First of all, thank you, Heather. Thank you, Pace, for the invitation. Very happy to be here with all of you. The outlook is concerning. There's been a slight marginal improvement in some of the test scores and the learning outcomes. I'm actually using some, if you can pull up some of those slides. So as you can see in that chart, and this is going to be news to no one here, there was a pretty dramatic decline in both ELA and math outcomes after the pandemic, and they've recovered a little bit in math, pretty stagnant, still declining in ELA. So there's a lot to be done there. And we know how these gaps kind of compound, and we also know that the losses have been a lot worse for African American Latinx students, especially in the early grades, which is also another concerning fact. The indicator, though, that worries me the most is actually attendance. The figures on chronic absenteeism were really bad last year. 30% of kids chronically absent. They've improved this year, this latest year that we have data for, at 25%. But we have a lot of schools in which a very high proportion of the kids are not there. Another recent PACE publication that's coming out soon shows that in the majority of low-income schools, we have 30% or more of kids chronically absent. That is a lot of kids not in school every single day. And a lot of things happen in school. If the kids are not there, they're not happening. We know absenteeism is a very complex problem. It is different, the reasons that cause absenteeism in elementary than they are in secondary school. And it's nuanced. It's going to require a lot of collaboration between, this is one that schools by themselves can probably not do it alone. It really requires a lot of collaboration with community partners, with parents, et cetera. And chronic absenteeism is very important because it is tied not just to academic outcomes, it's tied to a whole host of other things. Behaviors that are developed in school, socio-emotional learning, skill sets that kids need as they progress through the grades and hopefully go on to college and the labor market. There are also places where kids receive a lot of services. And so one of the indicators, for example, that is particularly worrying to me is that some groups that were not super chronically absent before are very absent now. And I'm specifically talking about EL classified children. They used to have, on average, pretty average chronic absenteeism, so they were not much more likely than the average student in the state to be absent. But their rates after the pandemic, and you can see it in this chart, tripled. So they went from being average to now being over 30% absent. Some of the rates for other subgroups, African American students, over 40% chronically absent. Youth in foster care, this is a group that's absent a lot, but it's even more absent after the pandemic. So all of these are kids that we need to reach, and hopefully we can transform our schools to be places where the kids want to be in and their parents want to send them to.
Thank you so much, Lucrecia. Carl, you spend a lot of time with superintendents across the state and have written a lot about polarization. Can you talk with us about the local political situation in school districts across California?
I studied to be a priest. I studied to be a priest before I got into education. I left all of that in 1968. If you had told me that today I would be writing commentaries for EdSource describing the Jesus of the four Gospels, there's no way I would have believed that that's what I would be doing. Tip O'Neill famously said, all politics is local. That adage has been turned on its head. All politics, according to David Brooks of the New York Times, all politics is now national. Steve Bannon, who I'm sure all of you tune into on a regular basis, said, "We may have failed to take over the national government on January 6th, but we're going to take over America one school district at a time. And we will be successful because people actually care about little kids." We're seeing new interest groups like Moms for Liberty, Gays Against Groomers, which creates a bit of cognitive dissonance with most audiences, and evangelical churches taking over local boards of education. I have been at school board meetings in Temecula, Chino Valley, Glendale, and Orange Unified. What's going to be consuming the leadership of K-12 school systems and superintendents from now through November? Recall elections. First up in the queue is Orange Unified on March 5th, followed by Temecula Unified at some point later in the year. And out for signature gatherings, thanks to Hiram Johnson and the history of California, folks who are frustrated by not getting what they want are going to go the initiative process. And so there's going to be big debates around forced outing and open discrimination against lesbian, gay, and transgender students versus parental notification. So stay tuned. It's going to be quite a ride if you're a political junkie. The thing that scares me for leadership of K-12 school systems, we're uncertain about the outcome.
Thank you so much, Carl. Joseph, you've been engaged in research about the pressures facing teachers and the educator workforce since the pandemic. Can you tell us what the status is at this point of the teaching profession in California?
I'm going to try, Heather. I'm going to try. Good morning. Joe Bishop, Executive Director, Center for the Transformation of Schools, UCLA. I want to start by thanking Heather and the PACE team for hosting us today. It's a lot of work to host a conference, am I right? So thank you. Show of hands. Who of you in this room know a teacher who has left the profession or is thinking of leaving over the last few years? Raise your hands. Okay. How many of you have children, nieces, nephews, grandchildren who are attending the school is struggling to staff the school? Raise a hand. Struggling to staff the school. Okay, I'll put my hand up too there. Okay, so the patterns that we are seeing in this room are not unique, unfortunately, to patterns we are seeing statewide. So first slide. Thank you, Heather. I guess I could use a clicker, sorry. Voices from the Classroom is a survey we conducted, a statewide survey recently with the California Teachers Association. You may have missed it because there was a lot of email traffic at the height of COVID, which is really when we collected most of this data. So we, again, surveyed 4,600 teachers. We oversampled teachers of color. I'm going to give you a quick highlight of what we found, okay, in our survey. First, 2 out of 5 teachers surveyed out of 4,600 are considering leaving the profession. 2 out of 5. 1 out of 5 say they will probably or definitely leave the profession the next few years. So the folks who respond to this may have left by the time, I'm sharing this data with you, but it's deeply concerning. When you look at teachers of color statewide, the numbers are higher. The response rate's higher in terms of more likely to leave. So why? Why are teachers leaving? It actually gets into what Cohn just shared. First, burnout. Burnout from stress was the number one reason why teachers were considering leaving the profession. Number 2, political attacks on teachers was the number 2 reason for possibly leaving the profession. Wrong way. Okay, when we asked 4,600 teachers in California, what word would you use to describe how you feel about your current position? The words used, 1 out of 2 teachers use these words: exhausting, stressful, frustrating, overwhelming. Less teachers, 1 out of 3, use the words rewarding and fulfilling, and even fewer, enjoyable and empowering. As we think about a path forward, I promise you we're not trying to bring the day down. Okay. Although it sure feels that way, right? So there's a report called When the Lights Are Turned On, documenting the impact of COVID in California. Dr. Tyrone Howard, who's your keynote today, is going to get into some of these themes. But aside from the survey, we also interviewed school psychologists, school counselors, principals, district officials to find out how COVID has impacted them. If you go, Dr. Howard's going to give you the main findings, and the report's now up today on our website, and it's on the PACE page, which Heather's going to talk about. You can get all the resources. You don't have to take camera shots of these slides. But what I will tell you is we need a comprehensive response as a state, which is not news to you. And I will tell you, as a state, I know our friends from CSLA will appreciate this, we need more real-time feedback and data from teachers and folks on the ground. We are making decisions without data as a state. We need to be much more intentional about how we collect data, how it's used, how it informs policy, how it informs practice, especially in a political environment where folks may ignore data or say it's not useful in this moment. We have to keep collecting data and ask folks on the ground, what do you need to be successful? And PACE today is largely about that. So we'll keep going. Thank you, Heather.
Thanks so much, Joe. Edgar, the budget is on everybody's mind, of course. Can you talk about the major proposals and outlooks in the governor's budget and what we should expect in the year ahead?
Great, thank you, Heather. To complete the square of not optimistic news, we're going to talk about the budget. So I think you are all aware that I think we have our budget situation has turned. We had a situation coming out of the pandemic where we had multiple years of significant increases in funding. What we just have found out really in later than we typically do is that tax collections for what's really the 22-23 fiscal year, the year that has already ended, came in significantly lower than were anticipated. And the reason we didn't know that until December was because of the tax filing delays that were first given by the IRS and then extended by the state as well. So because of that, the state is entering into the 24-25 budget with a much significantly higher budget deficit than anticipated. So right now, in terms of what the governor just released the budget January 10, so a couple of weeks ago, I think our estimate of that the administration is solving for a $58 billion budget problem. Now, in the budget itself, there's actually not a lot in terms of reductions for schools, despite the fact that there's a $58 billion budget. What I would call this for schools is essentially a baseline budget. There's a very small cost of living adjustment for LCFF and other programs that typically receive it. There's additional funding to continue the expansion of programs that were recently enacted, like universal transitional kindergarten, universal school meals. There's no delay or pulling back on any of those. The one big proposal in terms of dollar amount is additional funding for green school bus grants, which both the governor and the legislature have expressed intent on providing more funding for that. But otherwise, pretty, again, like essentially a baseline budget. And in terms of what that means, in terms of how you can do that, I think one question is, how do we have a $58 billion deficit, but schools are largely unaffected? I think there's two big parts of what the budget includes to make sure that that's the case. One is a proposal that's essentially allowing $8 billion in spending in 22-23 above the minimum required funding for schools and community colleges. That essentially the administration is proposing schools. The state is counting that as a reduction and paying for the cost in future years, but schools and community colleges get to keep those funds. So that's a big part of how you can structure the budget without there being reductions to schools. The second piece is that we have a state rainy day fund called the Budget Stabilization Account, the BSA. There's also a separate Proposition 98 reserve where we've set aside funds during years where there was big increases in Prop 98. And the administration is proposing to use some of those funds to cover baseline costs in the current year and the budget year. But absent pulling funding from that reserve, we wouldn't have enough funding under the state's requirement for schools to actually fund those programs. So in terms of, this is the budget just came out 2 weeks ago. This is a 6-month longish process to get to a final budget. So there's still a lot of time left to figure out what the ultimate 24-25 budget will be for schools. I think our office will be looking at lots of the individual proposals over the next several months. But in terms of, we have a report that I think that's linked to that Heather has in the PACE in the document that you can get at. And we have a number of comments. I think I'll just highlight a few key ones here. One is I think our office is a little concerned that revenues might come in even lower than what the governor is proposing. Or is estimating in the budget. There's a $15 billion difference between their estimates and our estimates. So I think we've suggested for the legislature, you might want to start thinking about planning for if those revenues come in lower, because if you wait till May, then you have like a month to pass a budget. So starting to think about that now is good. The other thing we highlight is the $8 billion proposal that we think we just want to get a little more information to make sure we understand what the implications of that are. And then finally, just concerns about sustainability. So even if you were to adopt everything in the governor's budget, if all the revenues were right and you took all the governor's actions, there's projections that there would be $30 billion budget deficits in the out years. So it's not going to be a one-year budget problem that we'll solve and then move on. And so I think that's something that we're highlighting. In terms of what that means for schools, obviously, the out year, the multi-year issues is a little bit more challenging to predict. I think obviously in the short term, we're talking about much more constrained budgets. We had several years now where we were, the state was able to provide increases for LCFF that were beyond the cost of living adjustment. So 1 year it was instead of a 4%, which was the COLA, a 5% increase. In 22-23, there was a 13% increase to LCFF. And then last year it was just the statutory COLA, but the statutory COLA was 8%. So we've seen several years of strong increases. At this point, a 0.76% COLA is fairly small for school districts who are facing declining enrollment and normal cost increases like with step and column. That still might not be sustainable. There might be actions that they might need to consider to get their budgets in balance. And I think based on our concern about revenues, I think the that small COLA might be an optimistic scenario. If revenues do come in lower, likely you're going to see less funding for schools. The one issue I'd highlight that sort of complicates the issue, but is in some cases for districts will be helpful or maybe a little bit more of a challenge this year, is the fact that there's been a lot of one-time funding that schools have received that they can use for a variety of purposes. There was three rounds of federal funding that had these ESSER grants that went out to the field. The largest one was this third one, and the expiration for the use of that is September of 2024. So for those who maybe were spending ESSER funds on staffing and were hoping to, say, shift those costs to LCFF next year, that probably is more challenging now given the budget situation. However, there are these other state grants that the state has provided, a Learning Recovery Block Grant, Arts Music Block Grant. These have longer time frames, and so that will allow some flexibility for districts to say, we're going to move some of those and cover some of those costs with those block grants. And that was part of the intent of those grants. These were provided initially in 22-23, and the idea was we're going to spread out the timeline for a long time so that it helps to cushion some of the reductions that might happen when that federal funding falls off. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you all so much. So we're going to have a discussion now with the panel, and what I would like for all of you to do is you can either take a picture of this barcode, which will take you to a Google Doc where you can put in your questions for the panelists. It's also linked in the agenda, so if you're already on the agenda page in the section for right now, you can click on that and ask your questions for the panel, and I'll pass them along. But to start, while folks are putting in, you've all raised a lot of issues that are quite interrelated. So I want to start with teacher workforce issues, and you can all weigh in on this based on your own expertise. What are some of the promising practices or the types of solutions to this problem that you've seen statewide? Joe, do you want to start?
Our director for our Educator Diversity Project, Dr. Kai Matthews, is not here, but a lot of you know Kai. Kai could rattle off a few things right now, but what I will say is I think districts and higher ed partners are, and I can say this in broad terms, are working together in new and innovative ways, and we don't always know what's happening in terms of sharing staff, strengthening the pipeline for teacher ed programs, especially diversifying the teaching profession. So we have a lot of state money, a lot of one-time money around diversifying the profession. I think we have to figure out now structurally how do we change the systems to make teaching a more appealing profession, but as early as possible, before middle, before high school. And there are examples I think we could share that are on our website of examples of these pathways programs that have been documented. PACE has been part of this too, but offhand, I think there is silver lining that folks are working together more deliberately, more strategically, because there's just frankly not enough teachers to go around or staff to go around to address some of the issues that we've raised today.
Lucrecia.
Just to add to that, I think that all of us who have kids, I have 3 kids, 2 of them in high school, would not want teachers, their teacher to be exhausted, stressed out, and overwhelmed. That is definitely not sort of the front line of staff that we need to really overcome the enormous challenge that we have. In addition to that, we've heard reports, and there's been national surveys about this. Department of Education put out a national survey just really documenting the extent of just behavioral issues that schools are dealing with. And so the job has always been hard. It's become really hard. The absenteeism issue exacerbates it because at any given time, if 30% of the kids in your classroom are absent or in your school, there's like you're in this wheel of like catching up all the time. One additional wrinkle that I think we need to contend with in the future years is the rise in remote work for most workers out in the labor force, which is not available to teachers. And as young people are making decisions about, whether they want to get a teaching credential or go into this job that has basically zero flexibility, that is going to come into, that is going to be sort of a new concern that a lot of teachers and staff are going to be dealing with. I know Joe mentioned pathway programs. When I was back at Rand, we actually did a lot of work on teachers and principals, and the leadership part is really important because a lot of teachers leave their principal, basically, their school leaders, to move somewhere else. So there's good examples of principal pipeline development programs and really teaching principals how to support teachers. There's also been, in the literature, good examples of incentive programs to build a pipeline, not just for teachers, but also for all the support staff that is needed in schools right now. Our counselor ratios are really low. They're getting better, but they're still low. And I just really want to underscore what Joe said. We're kind of navigating in the dark here in terms of a lot of these things. There's some data, especially on staffing, counselors, teachers that are really old, the public data that's available for anyone on the website. And just improving working conditions. And staffing schools better is going to improve working conditions for teachers, because the more adults you have in a school, the more you can deal with school climate concerns. And so I think we do know that some things that work, it is, the budget conversation is sort of not what we want to hear, because a lot of those things take a lot of resources. They're not cheap. But if we want to have a high quality education system, and if we want to overcome what we just went through, we can't do it on the cheap, unfortunately. And I don't know where the money's going to come from. Some other people do that. But it really has to be a priority, because I think that the message is that this is urgent. And hopefully we can, and the teacher equation, the teachers are central to all of this.
It's going to require school administrators to really step up and defend teachers. Concrete example from Temecula Valley Unified. There's a school board member there who is a wholly owned subsidiary of the 412 Evangelical Church. She walks in to back to school night and orders teachers to take things down from their classrooms, things that she doesn't like. Now, there was a time when some teachers would have said, "Screw you, get out of my classroom." But this is a school system where a high school drama teacher put on paid administrative leave for assigning Angels in America as one play of a number of plays that students could read. So that's the atmosphere that really kills support for teachers and makes their life incredibly more stressful.
We have a number of questions that are coming in about data and what kind of information we need to be collecting about teacher workforce, about spending, about even local politics, about local outcomes, and if the SBAC is the best or a good measure of student learning. So I'd like for each of you to reflect on what kinds of data need to be collected that aren't currently collected, and who should be monitoring that. Edgar, do you want to start?
Yeah, I will start, but I will couch it by starting with saying these data conversations, I think, are always a challenge because many ideas at the state level to collect data get killed because there's concern that we don't want to have to report and collect all that information. So I think part of the question, I think, is being strategic about what we want to collect. And then also, part of the challenge is, for example, other measures aside from the SBAC, right? Interim measures, every district uses, not every district uses its own unique thing, but districts get to decide which platforms they use, which measures they're going to use. And so at the state level, when you're talking about that, if you're talking about something that's going to be statewide, you're talking about deciding on something that's going to apply across the state sometimes if it's going to be useful. So I think those are some of the important challenges in trying to address it. But I think in terms of some of those questions, I think there is a lot of information, other ways to measure, for example, interim progress for students that we don't do that I think would be helpful if we learned, we don't have a statewide school climate measure, which I think would be helpful for getting at some of the, I think we have the statewide standardized test, which again, there might be concerns not kind of fully getting at what's going on with student learning, but also if we really are saying we want to care about the well-being of students, and that's really important front and center, then having that be part of a statewide collection that we can see is really valuable. With that, I think the challenge is there's the challenge of like the costs of developing the data and pulling that up, but it's also just making decisions about what are we going to collect at the state level, and that often requires less choice locally, and I think that's part of the reason why so many things get derailed at the state level.
Yes, just to add on to that, there were things like socio-emotional learning outcomes that many districts stopped collecting even before the pandemic that, were useful indicators now would have been useful indicators now to understand what the state of that is. Same for the school climate. I think, California Healthy Kids Survey, there's a lot of really good information there, but last time I checked, that is not really collected on a kind of not even real time, but even more frequently. The teacher survey, I think we need kind of like a schools and staffing survey like the NCS had, which they also cut, to understand really the state of our workforce, and not just for teachers. That needs to include staffing and counselors. I was writing a report on sort of student well-being generally after the pandemic and trying to really understand the counselor-student ratio, like really basic stuff. I mean, we're not really talking anything super sophisticated. And I ended up relying a lot on the Getting Down to Facts reports that many people in this room contributed to, data from 2018, maybe 2017 in some cases. Honestly, not acceptable in California. Like, I'm from Mexico. I grew up in Mexico. I've lived in a country with really bad data, and I never thought I would be sort of really digging like an archaeologist to like find some of these data.
Obviously, we need more data on school board members, school board elections, superintendent tenure. One of the things, I was here in Sacramento at a meeting maybe 6 months or so ago, and Vernon Billy, the executive director of CSBA, gave an extraordinary figure about since 2018, something like 30–40% of school board members in California are new. What are the implications for that, and what kind of training? The other thing, we need some good old-fashioned data from people who do work on political parties. One of the reasons why this evangelical church in Temecula that I'm harping on, one of the reasons why the Republican Party, in concert with them, where historically school board elections have been nonpartisan in California, the Republican Party in Riverside County decided for the first time in our mailers to Republican households, we're going to put a big fat R next to the church-sponsored candidates. Those kinds of changes, I don't think there's anybody out there collecting the data doing that kind of work, and it's important for us to at least find out.
Heather, I think there's a vision question and there's a process piece. In terms of process around data, I think we need to ask what we should be asking. If you think about that, ask what we should be asking. Ask parents, community groups, teachers, administrators, what they need, what they want for their kid to be successful, for their student to be successful, for as a teacher to be successful. We need to stick to our agenda. We have a lot of reporting requirements, so I might be contradicting myself, but I think the third point is eliminate unnecessary reporting and data. We are, oddly enough, data rich, but sometimes it's outdated or it's just sitting on a website and nobody's using it for implementation purposes. In terms of vision, I think we have to think about in-school and out-of-school. Out-of-school factors are more predictive of student achievement than in-school factors. We need to think about how health, housing, education, the environment, and the data that we're already collecting as a state is connected. And for the districts and states, the districts and schools that Lucrecia talked about, Heather's going to get more to absenteeism. Like it's the same schools, it's the same communities, but these systems and data systems, even our longitudinal data system, is a education-centric system, and we're ignoring these other factors that are predictive of what young people need and where the resources should go. So again, in school, out of school, we need to change the process as well.
We're getting a lot of questions tapping into this tension between local control and state support. So I'd like for each of you to reflect a bit on, in this year ahead with the current challenges and in many districts crises that are facing them. They need to be making strong strategic plans. They need to be implementing a really powerful LCAP. They need to be engaging locally and monitoring data. But we also know that they need support to be able to do the kinds of things maybe they're struggling to do. And we have a system of support. We have technical assistance infrastructure. How do we think about the interplay between what local leaders need to do and what state leaders and structures need to support?
As someone who served on the State Board of Education during the implementation of LCFF LCAP, I am absolutely appalled and embarrassed when I hear about 300 or 400 page LCAPs. The intent was simple. Get the folks who have been left out of the discussion, get them involved in how to create positive outcomes for kids who historically have been underserved. That's what this was supposed to be about. It wasn't supposed to be the new, biggest, bureaucratic, create a document that goes on and on. It was supposed to be engage those folks who might have some good ideas about better serving youngsters who historically have been left behind. Great idea, great principle of subsidiarity. Just like Governor Brown, I studied to be a priest before I got into education. I know what that principle is about. It's all about making sure that you don't have to rely on ever higher levels of government, whether Sacramento or Washington, D.C. So we've lost the original intent, and I would argue we need to go back and get this right, because producing these lengthy documents, to me, makes absolutely no sense.
I can jump in. I think this question is basically what my entire life at the LAO has been, which is how much does the state, and particularly when you're thinking about budget conversations, how much does the state decide how funds should be spent, what the rules should be, and how much should we provide flexibility to locals? I think that it's a big and challenging question. I think when I think to your point, Heather, there's a lot of challenging circumstances that districts will face. I think the way our system is designed is that we do have systems of support. That support is primarily at the county office of education level. So there is, and there's a lot of county offices that provide significant amounts of support to their districts. When we've talked to people, there's two challenges. One is the capacity across county offices can vary. So in some county offices, maybe they don't have that same level of capacity to provide support. The second is some districts don't want to hear from their county office of education, and sometimes it's because of historical relationships or other things. And so trying to find the balance of we want to provide support or sometimes gently guide you to go somewhere, but at the same time still saying you have a publicly elected local school board, that's ultimately who makes the decisions, is just always, often just a very challenging balance. And I think a lot of times at the state level, we are trying to set some of those, try to toe that line, and some of those things can get challenging, like, for example, with the LCAPs, as Dr. Cohn has mentioned. I think part of the challenge, I think, is, with LCAPs, I'm not sure how I feel about LCAPs. I would say sometimes it feels a little like there's this Dwight Eisenhower quote that I'm not going to get right, but it's sort of like plans are meaningless, but planning is essential. And when we've talked to school districts, the fact that they have to do this 100-pound, maybe it is 100 pounds, 100-page document does force conversations locally that maybe weren't happening before. It's very clear in our conversations that some of these conversations between, say, the business office and the curriculum and instruction folks was not happening prior to LCFF. So I do like to think there has been progress in that way, but there's definitely always an opportunity to look at what the specific requirements we have are and how we can make them less onerous and more focused on getting the things that we want, which is the thoughtful thinking about what your plan should be and focusing on the students that need the most support.
I'm a big believer in local control. I think there's a lot of information that happens at the local level that is best harnessed there. But I think that if we learned something from the pandemic is that when people are working very much in isolation, it becomes very hard to sort of understand what it is that has to be done. If we're doing presidential quotes, I guess, trust but verify. But also, it's not just about verifying, it's also about leading and coordinating. The state does have the power to harness resources that individual districts don't, and to provide a vision. Many of our urban cities are becoming, schools in urban areas are becoming increasingly segregated. And if we think about what Carl just said, these school board environments, there may be areas that the state can provide a vision that is sort of sustainable longer term and that adopts some principles that municipalities in some cases may not want to adopt. And so that there has to be that tension there. So it's a very difficult question. I see a role for both, but I definitely, I think local control is good, but the state does need to provide more guidance, support, data, research, and a vision as well.
Joe, I'm going to ask a broader final question. So we're getting a lot of questions from the audience about big picture things that are sitting above these issues that we're talking about. So, are we paying our teachers enough? Do we need to do more cross-sector visionary organization and work? When are we going to have a big structural conversation about taxes and budgets? So I'd like each of you in your final response here to just say if you were in charge and you got to pick one thing that is a really visionary approach, what would you choose and how would you approach it? Joe, do you want to start?
All right, Heather. Thinking on the fly here. Wow, you could say a lot of things. Folks have talked about a children's cabinet, bringing together agencies, and other states are experimenting with this, but bringing together agencies, sectors, partners, philanthropy together around young people as the kind of grounding for our focus and our work and why we're here in this room. I think there needs to be more proactive bringing people together in that regard, across agencies and across resources and people. With young people at the center. Second thing, multi-year budgets. It is really hard for districts to plan and for our state to plan, frankly, right? I'm looking at the Department of Finance when we're operating year to year. But we need to have some visionary thinking around how we budget as a state. And that has to be some multi-year commitments. The one-offs, the one-year funding are politically, everybody likes it, but it's not sustainable, and it's really hard for folks to plan, for communities to plan, especially at the local level, if we really say we're a local control state.
I was at a Spencer Foundation board retreat earlier this week, and State Supreme Court Justice Goodwin Liu was there, and we had a panel on legal issues and education. And he said something that I thought was very interesting. He said, Bill Clinton and George W. Bush were in fact education presidents, and that we have not had that since that time. And so when I think about our own nation state by the Pacific, I think we need a real education governor, not so much around here's a surplus or here's more money, but a real vision for how California kids are going to be educated in this century. So, and I'm not endorsing any candidate, but I think that's a really important conversation to have when you look at the history of our state and the incredibly important things. When I tell students at the doctoral level today that it costs me $750 a year to get a doctorate at UCLA, they are like, you're making that up. That's not true. That is true. We need to get back to some of the things that really defined California, and the only way we're going to do that is by getting a real California governor.
Wow. It's hard to follow. I think the funding part is really important. I think LCFF did a lot to improve funding for schools, and more needs to be done. And I like the recent sort of emphasis on community schools. I think that the pandemic showed us, whoever didn't know it before, what important community hubs schools are. And the more we can involve more people from the community to really step into the school and to be a part of it, the less we're going to be kind of subject to the people that show up to the school board meetings at 10 p.m. on a Tuesday night. And so community schools will require a lot more resources and coordination efforts, but I think that they are an important policy choice for us.
I mean, maybe just to build on that, I think, because there's so many places you could go. I think one thing I think of is there is this increasing conversation about some of like the out of school factors and other things that we can do to help support kids. And even a lot of the big, we did a lot of increases in LCFF, but a lot of the other things that we've done over the last several years after the pandemic is universal meals, community schools grants, expanded learning, so essentially before, after, out of school care. I think in a lot of that funding, we're providing locals, we're providing local community schools grants, but I think thinking through big picture, like where the state can help and break some of those barriers, because what ends up happening is some local areas where there is a lot of innovation, good coordination, you can see a lot of things get implemented well, but what can we do to help make sure that's happening across the state so that it's not just those who are very entrepreneurial or proactive, and make it easier for those who maybe don't have that same capacity to be able to integrate these kinds of things in their schools, and also have their students maybe be better connected to all of the other services and things that are existing locally.
Thank you all so much. So I want to make sure to acknowledge a lot of the questions that were coming in said, well, what do we do about this? How do we train superintendents to better solve these problems? What kinds of practices can we put into place to address chronic absenteeism, to accelerate learning? And the good news is that's what the whole rest of the conference is designed to do, is to answer those questions. But we wanted to make sure that here at the beginning, we had a really good foundation for these challenges and the data that are undergirding a lot of the sessions that we're going to follow up on.